Hey folks, how's it going? It's Rob Avis here, and today we've got a really great show planned for you guys. We're going to be talking about food forestry and bioshelter market gardens, which is just another way of saying passive solar greenhouses. I'm specifically speaking to Darrell Frey, who wrote the Bioshelter Market Garden and the Food Forest Handbook, two topics that are really close and dear to my heart. So if you're just signing in, please let us know your name and where you're calling in from. And I'm really hoping that the audience comes forth with some really great questions today, because there's lots to cover. There's lots to talk about. What's really cool about being able to chat with Darrell is that I would call Darrell a first generation permaculture practitioner, designer, teacher. He's really been in it as long as pretty much all the greats that you'd think about. He's right alongside. I think he might even have been in permaculture longer than Jeff Lawton. Maybe, I'm not sure what year Jeff actually got in. That'd be a good question for him that we'll ask him when we get into the interview today. So yeah, if you're just signing in, let us know where you're calling in from, and let us know one thing that you want to get out of today's call around food forestry and a veteran passive solar greenhouse designer. I mean, somebody that basically was building these structures at the same time as the New Alchemy Institute. And if you've never heard of them, you can Google them. These were kind of the pioneers of these structures back in the, and again, I'm going to have to rely on Darrell's knowledge on this, because I've read a lot about New Alchemy, but I can't remember the exact years. I think it was around the 70s and 80s during the oil embargoes, but I'm not positive on that. So yeah, let us know where you're calling in from, and we'll get this interview going here right away. So before we get started, just a little bit of background. If this is the first time that you've signed into the Ideas on the Verge webinar series, interview series that we're doing here on YouTube, this is the result of Michelle and I writing a book on rainwater harvesting and getting to know New Society publishers and trying to find a way to collaborate with them. And so we came up with this idea of doing Ideas on the Verge, where we would interview thought leaders within their space twice a month, all around permaculture, economy, depletion, regeneration, all of these ideas that we talk about a lot on our YouTube channel already. And so it's been a really great collaboration. I've learned a ton from talking to all these people. We've interviewed people like Richard Heinberg, Dmitry Orlov, Chris Magwood, the Raps, who are pretty well known for their meat rabbits. And so all of those videos are in this playlist that this video is going to be in later this afternoon. And so if you're just coming out for the first time, you might want to check some of those videos out. There's some incredible content in some of these other videos. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Sarah in and have her talk a little bit about New Society Publishers and why they're such an amazing publisher, which I can say that they are. But they do all sorts of kind of unique things that kind of differentiate them in their space. And so if you are an author looking to publish something unique within the permaculture or new economy or depletion space or any of the other kind of categories that they operate in, I highly recommend you check out New Society Publishers. So Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about New Society and what makes New Society a little bit different?
Okay, well, thanks so much, Rob. It's great to be here again. For those of you who don't know, New Society is an activist solutions-oriented publisher. We pride ourselves on walking our talk and having the highest environmental and social standards of any publisher in North America. This includes printing on 100% post-consumer recycled paper. We print all our books in North America and never overseas. We've been a carbon neutral company since 2006, and our employees are shareholders in the company. And we recently also became a B certified corporation, certified B Corp. So if you want to find more, you can check us out on our website or any of our social media sites. And we're thrilled to be able to collaborate with Verge Permaculture on this project. I really think that the sharing of ideas and information on as many platforms as possible is key to creating community and real change in the world. I want to give a shout out to all of our authors as well for their real willingness to share their often hard-won knowledge and expertise with readers and listeners. It really can be comforting when embarking on a new project or contemplating new and challenging ideas to know that someone's been through it before you and can walk you through it and help you to miss the many potholes that may reveal themselves along the way. So thanks very much, and it's really great to be here with you all.
All right, folks. Well, just before I bring in Darrell, I've just got to figure out how to get back to my my live screen here. That YouTube's changing all of their functions here. So just give me 2 seconds here and we'll get back to the interview. Darrell, if you want, you can come into the space right now if you want to unmute your microphone. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you involved in permaculture and when you started? You've been at this for quite some time now, and I'd like to kind of get your background, because you've kind of embodied, in my opinion, that concept of the quiet revolution. I mean, there was a documentary that came out about the convergence in Brazil, and I think it was titled The Quiet Revolution, and you've kind of been working away for all these years, doing incredible work on the East Coast of the US, or eastern part of the United States. So tell us a little bit about when you got in and what got you interested in permaculture.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me on your program. And I too think New Society Publishing is amazing. Really, I got started in what is called permaculture probably when I was a child. I had lots of gardeners in my family. I would forage for wild berries in the streams and parks in my neighborhood. So as I wrote in my Bioshelter book introduction, when I was 12 years old on a family vacation to Niagara Falls, I bought the book called 12 Acres in Independence, or 5 Acres in Independence, I mean, as my souvenir. And I read this when I was 12, and I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to live somewhere where I have wild fruit and the fruit all year long. So I always had this in my mind. And when I was 18, I moved into a house in the country, and I met a lot of people homesteading. And they were teaching me how to raise goats and chickens and make compost. And after a couple of years, I started reading a lot of Mother Earth news magazines. And there was an interview of Bill Mollison where he talked about permaculture design. Actually, it was, I think, issue number 63, probably 1980 in the fall. And so I was very inspired. As soon as I read this, I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to become a permaculture designer. So I sent off and bought the book Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2, and I read those. And I think it was in 1982, I attended a 3-day workshop Bill Mollison taught at Stonyfield Farm in New Hampshire before it became a yogurt. They were just developing their yogurt recipe then. And that really confirmed that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to study permaculture, take a permaculture design course. And so I had a young family, I had a full-time job, and it was hard to go to a permaculture design course somewhere. So I spent several years trying to get one to happen in my neighborhood. Eventually we had teacher Dan Hemingway come to Slippery Rock University in 1986 to teach a design course. And so basically from 1980 till 1986, I would read every reference I could for Bill Mollison, and then I would spend the summer studying native plants and gardening, and spend the winter reading about landscape techniques and climate near the ground and whatever other references I could, and then took my PDC in 1986.
Super interesting. And so just before I ask this next question, as I've mentioned, guys, people on YouTube, we're going to be talking about Darrell's books, the Food Forest Handbook and the Bioshelter Market Garden. And so one of the things that we do on the Ideas Show twice a month is we have a coupon. So the coupon code is given at the end of this show if you're on our email list. And so you can sign up for our email list in the show notes below. There's a URL there that you can go to and sign up, and then there'll be a coupon code delivered right after this show. So if you're interested in these books after this interview, if you feel like it's going to help you to progress your property, you get 25% off both of his books for 48 hours after this show. So Darrell, given the fact that you've been in this space for so long and you've been thinking about this for at least 2.5 times longer than me, I'm curious. I'd like your definition of permaculture. I'd like to hear what's your short soundbite for what permaculture actually is.
Yeah, I anticipated this question, but I didn't think too much on it. I have taught close to 30 permaculture design courses. So my definition used to be very long, but now many more people know about permaculture. So usually I say it's a design system that draws its influences from ecology, traditional practices with the land, and appropriate technologies. So basically I try to focus on the design system aspect of permaculture. And Bill Mollison, I think in the Designer's Handbook, defines permaculture as a system of ecological design and a landscape that is designed using this system.
Fantastic. So when you set out on your journey, you talk a little bit about getting your farm and the amount of time and energy that it took to build that farm. What were your biggest goals for purchasing your farm? And maybe you can talk a little bit about your ecosystem so people can kind of relate to what it's like out there.
Yeah, we're in northwestern Pennsylvania. It's considered a continental climate. So the growing season runs from, May through October. It's a little longer now than it was originally. We've had frost as early as August 30th, sometimes September 15th. We've had frost in the spring as late as June 6th. Usually it's around May 15th. When I was looking for property, first my ex-wife and I were looking for a place to build our home. We did an owner-built home. And we were also looking for a place to have a market garden. And a friend had just bought 10 acres with a 5-acre field. And so he told us we could do our market garden in his field. And about the same time, we found 10 acres wooded property with a couple small clearings, abandoned cornfields. So we built our house 5 miles from the farm. And my ex-wife set up some amazing gardens there. But mostly we located to the farm site, lived in a mobile home. And so the farm was ideal. Farm location had a spring running through it that provided a place for a pond. It had a level area for setting up a bioshelter and a yard and a home. And it had kind of gently rolling land that we could use for market gardening. Very good soil. And one problem was it was in the snow belt and cloud belt from Lake Erie. So
right.
Built a solar greenhouse, but if we'd have built it 40 miles further south, we might have had a little more sun, but that was just a minor issue.
So what was it that inspired you to, you've clearly put a lot of emphasis into the passive solar greenhouse. I want you to maybe, because I mentioned the New Alchemy Institute, and you talk a little bit about it in your book, and I ran into it in the early days when I first started learning about permaculture, because it was just such a unique experiment that happened. And there were several, I think, arcs, weren't there? Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the New Alchemy Institute and how it started, who started it, and why it stopped, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, my own interest in greenhouse again started when I was a child. After school, I would go walk through this greenhouse, and I collected a lot of cactuses for like 25 cents a piece, maybe a dozen or more. I wanted an excuse to go to this greenhouse because I just thought it was really amazing to walk through this greenhouse. So I'd use my allowance to buy plants and cactuses. And I always wanted to have a greenhouse. And again, Mother Earth news magazines had articles about bioshelters and about the New Alchemy Institute. And some magazine was very short-lived called New Roots, sent me a free copy for some reason. It must have been on some mailing list, but it had a profile of the New Alchemy Institute. Basically, it started as a research center to, there was an oil crisis, an energy crisis in the 70s, and there was environmental crises going on. And some of the founders, John Todd, his wife, Nancy Jack Todd, a biologist named Bill McLarney, got together and wanted to create a solutions-based research center. And one of the things they decided to do was to build these solar greenhouses, and they called them bioshelters to distinguish them from commercial chemical managed greenhouses. The idea was to create an indoor ecosystem, to use passive solar design so you wouldn't need fossil fuels to heat it. Also actually active solar to move heat around into storage. And so the New Alchemy Institute was active from basically 1972 or 74 to 1990, and went through a transition of different managers and different people there. John Todd moved on to his living machine business. And basically they built a bioshelter and other solar structures on Cape Cod at the New Alchemy Institute. They built one in Prince Edward Island in Canada, a large, again, solar greenhouse. And just reading about these things were really inspiring. And so as I planned my market garden business, I knew that a bioshelter would be a really important part of it. We were also inspired by Anna Eadie's Solviva bioshelter on Martha's Vineyard Island. And we consulted with her some, and we kind of adapted her floor plan. And then we consulted with people at New Alchemy Institute. We visited New Alchemy in 1988 and toured their greenhouses and bioshelters, and just were very inspired.
Tell me a little bit about, you mentioned in your email yesterday to me that Mollison had actually come to your site. So what was that like for you?
Oh, that was amazing. Yeah. When I took a permaculture course in 1986, it was sponsored by a professor at Slippery Rock University, Bob McCoskey. And he invited me to teach permaculture there again in 1987 and 1988, which was like throwing me in the deep end. And I told him after that I needed to just run my farm and I couldn't teach for a few years. But he had created a master's degree of sustainable systems. And in the permaculture course there in 86 and 87, we did a design for what became the McCoskey Center for Sustainable Systems Education and Research, known as the McCoskey Center, which is still functioning. And the McCoskey Center was managed by a group called the ALTER Project, Alternative Living Technology and Energy Research Project. And so ALTER was sponsoring a lot of workshops, and we had written to Bill Mollison to get permission to teach permaculture at the university. And so the lecture series, I think Bill Mollison was touring the US, so Dr. McCoskey invited Bill to come to Slippery Rock to teach a couple of different workshops and do some lectures. And so as part of that, we invited him to the farm for lunch. And I think he was traveling with Scott Pittman at the time, excuse me. So my neighbor Jack, who sold us the 5 acres for the farm, had some venison in the freezer, and we were just developing our wild edible salad mix. So we had an interesting lunch, what Mollison called the venison Pennsylvania kangaroo. But so it was pretty interesting. He was a bit of a character. A week later, he was in Washington, D.C., speaking to a group of congressional aides and legislators that a congresswoman had set up. And my brother was there because he was a legislative aide in Congress at the time. And he said that Bill Mollison came in slightly intoxicated and proceeded to tell off the US government. And so that was kind of a misstep in the permaculture development, but.
Crazy. Yeah, it sounds a little bit like Bill. I had the pleasure of meeting him twice before he passed. So, you know, it's not every day that I get to speak to somebody who's been thinking about permaculture since the 80s. And, you know, I've been pretty obsessed lately about the embodied energy of food, and we'll get to that in a second, as well as things like peak oil, given some of the authors that we've interviewed on this series. In fact, my permaculture career started as a result of peak oil because Michelle and I are both originally petroleum engineers. And it seems like the world is still crazy or crazier even than it was in the 80s. But I didn't have the ability to really understand what was going on in the 80s, given my age. And I just, can you, as somebody who's been thinking about this for so long, have things gotten better? Have things gotten worse? Are they getting crazier? Am I losing my mind? Can you like paint for me kind of, you talked a little bit about the oil embargo and the eco crises that were going on in the 70s. Where are we? Like, is it getting worse in your opinion? Are people waking up? I don't know how to formulate this question. I think you're kind of getting the sense of what I'm asking though.
Yeah. First, I want to say that I spent a lot of my teenage years living in the Allegheny National Forest and trout fishing beside oil wells that the tar pits were, you know, they'd pump excess crude into these pits and it would just leach into the streams, you know, and then they started gas wells. I also live in kind of ground zero for fracking. You know, there's gas wells everywhere. So I've been always aware of these issues. I think I became an environmentalist when I was fishing beside one of these great tar pits or crude oil pits and watching this stuff come into the stream and thinking about what might be getting into the fish when I was like 15 years old. And so I don't think they're allowed to do that anymore. I'm not sure they dump so much stuff in the water, but I was just at the NOFA New York conference, the Natural Organic Farmers Association. I attended a couple of workshops on permaculture. And when one of the speakers asked if anyone was familiar with permaculture, everybody in the room raised their hand. So permaculture has really grown, has really become wide known. We were kind of working in the wilderness through the 80s and 90s. I know David Jackie, I know Joe Jenkins you know, for all my adult life, and kind of neighbors, but there was a time when people weren't sure they wanted to keep using the word permaculture because it just wasn't understood. And then the late Thelmy Hemingway came out with Gaia's Garden, and that kind of relaunched permaculture. So permaculture had a resurgence probably about the beginning of this century. But our goal, one of my goals in building the farm, I just thought people have to create models for people to emulate. And you know, we have to teach people about permaculture, talk about it. We have to create models. And a lot of times when I'm describing permaculture, I explain that there was also agroecology developing, and there's the School of Ecological Design being developed. And really these things borrowed from each other. And now, you know, the city of Pittsburgh is putting in bioswales and rain gardens, you know, through nonprofits and so many organizations, you know, the Green Building Association's Living Building Challenge. There's a lot of major steps that are being taken in society that have kind of integrated permaculture. You know, what they call regenerative agriculture seems to borrow a lot from permaculture. We were at a meeting at Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh. The guy who founded the Living Building Challenge was speaking, and one of my colleagues raised their hands and said, "How much of this did you get from permaculture?" And he kind of laughed, and he's like, "Well, we can talk about that later." But you know, there are more and more models of sustainability. You know, my own farm has inspired a few bioshelters, at least, and I work at one in the summer here in Pittsburgh. Garfield Farm, Market, Bioshelter, and so there's a lot of models, but at the same time, our catastrophe of humans living on the planet is accelerating. And so it's a race of how soon people learn, wake up, and hopefully the models that are in place, so many urban farms. In Pittsburgh now, people are using goats, instead of herbicides to cut down weeds on the riverbanks. And there's just so many good things in place that have come out of ecological design and permaculture. Again, it's just a matter of how, when the masses wake up to, follow these models and learn more from them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the main reasons that I've invested so much time into YouTube in the last little while is that if we're not actually hosting these conversations, then just the other side of the spectrum is, it's difficult to find the positive information out there because I think so many people are so driven by clickbait, and we're kind of witnessing the end of the era of mainstream news. And so as they get to they're kind of on their deathbed, they're kind of focusing more on the sensational, nasty things that are happening in the world, as opposed to goats eating weeds off the bank of the river in Pittsburgh, or bioshelters, providing food for less fortunate people, or whatever it happens to be. And so I think that it's time for permaculture to be less of a quiet revolution, still passive, but more active in actually telling our story. One of the things that I've thought a lot about is the importance of story in terms of directing humanity towards this more positive future that we all desperately need to row together towards to get to. So I want to switch the conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about something that I've been spending some time looking at, and maybe we can use this as a lens to talk about some of the solutions that you've modeled on your farm and discussed in both of your books. So I'm just going to share my screen with folks here. Just give me 2 seconds while I pull this up. It's going to expose the engineering nature of myself here pretty quickly with all the numbers and spreadsheets. So I've been doing a little bit of math recently. I gave a talk at the Eco Symposium here in Ontario last week, and I was asked to talk about integrated design, specifically kind of helping architects and engineers understand what permaculture is so that they could start applying it within their own systems. And so what I did was I looked at the embodied energy of various things that humans do. And so I looked at food, I looked at space heat, I looked at power, domestic hot water, wastewater, delivery of potable water, and transport. And I could not believe my eyes when I started doing some calculations, the amount of energy that it takes to feed a North American right now. So food in North America, like the amount of energy, what I did basically was I tried to normalize all the numbers so that they'd use the same units. And so the amount of gigajoules, regardless of whether you know what a gigajoule is, I'll explain, and I'm talking to YouTube right now, what a gigajoule is in 2 seconds here. So we'll just look at the numbers and then I'll kind of break this down so that there's some numeracy. So food takes about 55 gigajoules of energy. And this is because every calorie of food that we consume in North America requires 10 calories of hydrocarbons to produce it. To heat our homes, and by the way, these numbers are per capita per year. So to heat our homes is around 18 gigajoules per person per year. To power our homes is around 10 gigajoules per person per year. Domestic hot water is about 0.5. Wastewater is about 0.6. Potable water. So for the city to bring potable water to you, I thought this number was going to be way bigger, but it's 0.07 gigajoules. And then transport is almost the same as food at 42. And so this represents about 126 gigajoules a year. Now, 1 gigajoule, to put this into kind of a context people can understand, is equivalent to 277 Olympians operating for 10 hours. So if you had 277 Olympians riding bikes, like pedal bikes, at full capacity for 10 hours, you'd be able to generate 1 gigajoule. So one person basically needs 277 Olympians operating for 10 hours for 55 days in order just to eat in our society. Now, if we were all coyotes and we were having to consume our own lipids, our own fats at a ratio of 10 to 1, we'd all starve really quickly. So this was one of the things that kind of got me initially interested in permaculture, was this concept of peak oil. And given that I was in the oil and gas industry and recognizing that, that we potentially were coming to a cliff, but I had no idea that food was one of the largest footprints from an energy perspective that we actually had as North Americans. I always thought it was space heat or even like driving around in vehicles all year long. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that, Darrell? You've probably thought a little bit about this over the last 30 years with regards to the embodied energy of our food.
Yeah, I don't necessarily keep facts and figures in my brain, but when we designed our Bioshelter, we were trying to demonstrate that you can grow food year-round in a cold climate without the use of fossil fuels. We heated our Bioshelter with a combination of passive and active solar, biothermal energy from compost, and wood heat. We used about 3 cords of wood a year. According to the last I checked, wood heat is not considered biogenic, so it's not sustainably harvested wood. And in Pennsylvania, wood heat is fairly available. We weren't adding fossil carbon while we're growing food. And just, I often wanted to calculate how many, in the US we say BTUs, but how much heat energy or solar energy, photovoltaic energy is falling on my farm. We had to drive 60 miles to deliver our produce, but we could deliver it all in, any farm has to deliver. And we'd fill up a van, deliver produce, leave in the morning, be home in the evening, 1 day a week. And, I never really did the calculations for how much local grown produce. We were pioneers. We were like the first farmers to walk into the door in many of these restaurants we sold to. Now there's dozens and dozens of local farms selling produce in the Pittsburgh area. But to me, for the energy equation to work out, there needs to be a lot more farmers. I would get interviewed by newspapers every year. We were the people they talked to about local food, and people would say, "Why are you giving your information away?" And I'm like, we need many more farmers to deal with this situation. So, we're dropping the bucket, bringing a van load of produce to Pittsburgh when all these trucks are coming in. But now with so many more farms, that drop in the bucket is probably a bucket load.
Right.
Compared to, so, I think a lot of my work has been to engender, to be involved, to get more organic farmers, to get more market gardens, and so again, I never really did the calculations, but I just intuitively knew that we were creating a model that if enough people did it, wouldn't be changing the climate.
I think you don't have to do the calculation per se. I mean, not everybody's going to use spreadsheets and be engineers, but I mean, intrinsically, I think when you look at the pattern that you followed, you built a passive solar greenhouse that used minimal fuel, and the fuel that it did use was renewable, both through decomposition and through the combustion of a renewable resource. And you invested heavily in food forestry. I mean, there were market gardens in there as well, but both of these two systems, I don't think you could have had that foresight without at least a knowledge in your gut that the food system that we had was intrinsically unsustainable. I mean, it doesn't really matter that that you didn't have the numbers, you didn't do a calculation. You led by example. And so, what were those insights that led you to moving towards? Was it specifically energy, or were there other things involved in making that decision to put your hard earned on the table, build that bioshelter, put the food forest up? Like, what was it that was it nutrient density, local food, all of the above? Like, were there specific things that kind of stood out for you?
Yeah, I've often half jokingly said my farm was more of a permaculture research center than a business enterprise. But we had to pay the bills, pay the insurance, pay the property taxes. So, it was a business enterprise. But, my original goals were to grow food without the use of fossil fuels, except for rototiller and delivery, and to show that with permaculture design, you can increase the biodiversity in the landscape while building the soil quality and marketing a crop. And, to me, the funnest part of my permaculture farm, besides all the various fruits, apples, plums, peaches, blackberries, blueberries, currants, gooseberries, hardy kiwis, and so on, elderberries, was just the biodiversity, watching it move in, watching all the frogs come in when we build the pond, and the herons and ospreys coming through, wild ducks in the pond, and just the incredible amount of beneficial insects. And, as the tree lines grew and the native landscape developed, the farm became more productive, and the landscape became more diverse. And I did calculations on how much heat it would take to heat a greenhouse. When we built our bioshelter, we could heat it on 3 cords of wood, and the year we built it, it would have cost $8,000 to heat a similar sized glass greenhouse with natural gas. Within 3 or 4 years, the price of natural gas and fuel oil tripled, and it went up to closer to $20,000 to heat these greenhouses. So, we were looking at the economics of the energy, and then the global impact of the carbon usage.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a little bit about Dave Jackie, and I want to bring in some of the ideas out of his book quickly before we kind of move over into your food forestry stuff. He talks about on the eastern coast of the United States, there being upwards of 30 million people, that most of the trees were edible. He kind of insinuates that there was a form of food forestry being practiced. And then when the settlers moved in, basically they cleared it to move to more annual crops. And so now you as a practitioner are, or have, in that same space, I mean, you are inland, but still in a very similar space, have started to bring those ideas back into play on your farm. And I'm curious if you can just provide our listeners with an arc of how that you transformed that system from start to finish, and some of the insights that you had as a result of doing that. Like, how did you manage all the different stages of succession? And were there any kind of insights that you had as a result of that 30-year transition, now looking back on it? And maybe what would you do differently?
Yeah, I would spend a few years planning this farm before we actually started doing it. I knew we had the land. We put it in, it was in corn and soybean rotation for 20 years or more before we took it over. We put in a hay crop of mixed clover to build the soil. And then I would draw up drawings that would show a greenhouse, and then I knew the greenhouse would need a windbreak, and there was an existing tree line with no understory. So when we really moved forward to build the bioshelter was when I got in the mail, I got a request for proposals for grants to save energy in agriculture from used to be a Pennsylvania energy office. And so as soon as I got this in the mail, I thought, this is my bioshelter. And I started working. I had like 40 days to get together with a team of people and put together the budget and my grant proposal. And so early on, first thing I did was I redrew my sketch to show where the tree lines would be, where the pond would be. And then as we built the bioshelter, one of the first things we did was plant a series of a tree line of plum trees and raspberries and high bush cranberries, and kind of running north to south to shelter the bioshelter from the winds. And then we set up what became our food forest with a hedge of lilacs, juneberries, rose hips. Again, as another second layer of windbreak. So a lot of the plantings were intended to be multifunctional. And in the Bill Mollison's permaculture books, he shows these sun trap diagrams where you use the trees to create windbreak and kind of surround the building, protect it, with the bushes and trees. So, and then the other thing we did was we let the native dogwood and other shrubs come into our tree line. There was a commercial farm to the north, a dairy farm, and every few years he would use an herbicide. So we wanted a really thick barrier. So we let the native plants and native dogwood shrubs come in. And so that created a dense hedge. And of course, we planted things like basswood trees and nettles and herbs in the landscape. And but just we just kept adding more plants to the tree line, a hedgerow of blueberries, and adding an crab apple tree that we really like, dogal crab, in the middle of the herb garden to become the food forest, and hardy kiwi vine trellis next to that to protect the building. But so most of the perennials close to the building were laid out to protect the building, create that sun trap.
And so I'm just curious how that success, like, were there any insights watching that succession go through time? Like, Jeff Lawton talks a lot about, planting in 90% pioneers on the front end and then chopping and dropping them out. What did that look like in your ecosystem?
Yeah, the farm is 5 acres, and we were intensively gardening about 2 acres, maybe a quarter acre was for home and my kids to play soccer or whatever, pond. So on the far, what I call zone 3 was our orchard, apple trees, pear trees, and we planted black currants and asparagus and ajuga and tansy as an understory. And then a lot of things came up on their own around the pond, some aspen trees on the one side and alders, which took nitrogen, on the other. So we kind of let the pond bank develop, let the June berries and native nannyberry viburnums come up, but we would cut back any maple trees or anything we didn't want there. And but we didn't really do much. I didn't have to plant pioneer species. I just needed to mulch. Our biggest problem was grass trying to move in and trying to mulch. Bill Mollison talks about it's better to plant 10 trees than 100. So I tried to stick with that theory, just to buy 5 or 10 trees from Fedco trees every year, or St. Lawrence nurseries in New York. I try to buy my trees from Hardy Landscapes. And it was really a challenge to develop the market garden and to get more perennials planted. So it was a long, slow evolution. As the farm transitioned, as it evolved, we started transitioning our far gardens over into more fruit trees, more orchard. And that's kind of the next succession there. We put swales through what we call our west garden, and we started planting leguminous shrubs and just more fruit trees in that area.
Right. So it sounds like it's a bit of an Eden now.
But yeah, my insight is that it's just really hard to market garden and plant perennials. Oh yeah, it's great. We're not market gardening right now, but in this summer I had so many mulberries. It was amazing. Just stand under the tree with a big steel bowl and shake them into the branch. And my refrigerator is full of mulberries now and lots of blueberries. I have 5 grandchildren and 3 children that live near the farm, so they went out. My son picked a lot of our apples. We have we didn't make cider this year, but we stored a lot of the apples in the refrigerator. We have golden russets, which are a great apple, and Northern Spy, something called Greening, Liberty, just really good cider apples. We have some summer apples, Centennial, Chestnut, and the Dogo Crab, and Yellow Transparent, and number of pears, but just spend a lot of time up there just picking fruit this last summer, the last 2 years.
It's hard to understand why people wouldn't want this around their property. I mean, you plant it and it just keeps, once it's established, it just keeps giving back. I mean, there's labor to harvest it and things, but I just love the concept of a food forest. I think it's just such a wonderful idea.
Yeah, when I was working on the Food Forest Handbook, my co-author Michelle had, and her partner, business partner, Juliet Oshak and Michelle Zolba, had started a food forest in Pittsburgh, and Michelle wanted to co-author a book with me about it. But it was, what they had done, they had a city lot that was available, and within 5 years, they were producing, within 3 years, they had elderberries and currants and gooseberries, and within 4 or 5 years, they had Asian pears and apples, and just amazing how quickly. I think they mostly planted dwarf trees, but we're getting yields real fast. So,
yeah, amazing. So just before we head off to questions, and so if you're thinking about asking questions, there's a couple that have come up, which we'll get to here at the end of the call. Now's a great time to put those into the Q&A section. We'll also be giving a book away, one of Darrell's books away to one of the lucky chatters. So get up there and start chatting if you want to increase your chances of success there. Darrell, you talked a little bit about the Ecology of Eden by Evan Eisenberg and some of the insights that you've had reading that book. I want to maybe we can talk a little bit about just like where we've come from as a species, where we're going, and some of the insights that you had as a result of that book.
Yeah, in 1998, I went to a Bioneers conference, and I don't know if I saw that in a bookstore at the conference, but just the title caught my eye. It took me a year or two to read it, but just amazing. It's a really thick book, and he basically traces kind of the evolution of the human landscape. I mean, he talks about the Gaia hypothesis and permaculture, and where we should go with ecological design. But basically, he talks about how humans formed an alliance with fire, at least in Europe, probably most of anywhere humans lived, where we would use fire to maintain the savanna landscape for our game animals and for other foods, I guess, just kind of keep the land in that initial succession. You spoke about the native food forests in Pennsylvania. I discussed a couple historical references in both my books, the same reference of a food forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. But the land between up near Erie was maintained. I know a farmer whose property never had trees. When George Washington and the first Europeans came up through French Creek Valley in northwestern Pennsylvania, the land had been maintained with fire by the Native Americans basically since the ice receded, to keep these open meadows for the deer and the elk, and there was a herd of bison that lived in woodland bison. So humans have always used fire to maintain the landscape. And then as the ice age receded and we started growing grains, we just always had this alliance with grasses and with fire. And so he just traces the evolution of agriculture from the last 10,000 years as part of that alliance with the grain growing. And he also discusses some theories of Andrew Smuckler, who wrote a book called The Parable of the Tribes. Basically, he says that when agriculture developed, and the way I kind of describe it is, once we had surplus grains, we needed to have storehouses to store the grains. But what happens, and Eisenberg and Smuckler both talk about this, that agriculture degraded our environment. So when your crop failed and were dependent on food, then that led to military to go to invade the neighbors, to take their grain or to guard your grain. And this whole hierarchy of culture and military and industrial complex kind of co-evolved along with agriculture.
Interesting. Just having read Heinberg's book, he talks about how, just a bit of a tangent, but we reached peak grain production, I think it was in 1986 per capita. And so there's a couple of things going on there. One is the population has been increasing. And grain is either increasing slowly or it's neutral. He doesn't go into a lot of details on it, but we literally are coming to the limits of our ability to produce industrial crops for lots and lots of reasons, which I'm just actually in the midst of writing a blog about right now, but super interesting. And so how did those insights inform, what you've done in your life and on your farm, and what are the solutions?
Well, it's interesting. My partner, Jessie Swisher, is currently working on her master's in food studies. And she's choosing her focus to be grains. So we've been reading a lot about grains, of grain production, barley, spelt, and rye, taking workshops and reading about ancient grains. And, the Pennsylvania every small town had a mill, that ground their own grain, and their local farmers would grow their grains. They would grow flax, and so local small-scale grain production was very, very much a part of the economy. And I'm not sure, I presume it was somewhat sustainable, but I don't know the details. But we're trying to research, that's kind of a current missing link. There's a lot of farmers growing vegetables, and we know some grain farmers, but there's just not a whole lot of small-scale grain production, at least in Western Pennsylvania. So it's been interesting to see this research and thinking about, John Jevons, his book, One Circle Gardening, talks about how to grow a complete diet in a minimum area. John Jevons didn't write it, but he published it, Ecology Action. And so just this idea that, can you grow your own grains, and can you do it in your sustainable garden? So we're kind of on a current learning curve about all that. But I'm currently working more in the city. I'm not sure. I think half of all human populations live in urban environments, and a city like Pittsburgh has lots of vacant lots. It has lots of land, and so this idea that we need more market gardens, more little bioshelters all over, more local food production. The land's there and the space is there. Unfortunately, it's going to take a crisis to get more people to move towards doing it. So all our studies, again, are just to try to find the right models and try to find the right information to do these things on smaller scales. Right.
Yeah, I think the thing that's struck me about what you've written about in your two books is, I really hope that we don't need a crisis to make the change. That's at least the optimist in me speaking, but there are days when I think that that's probably what's gonna drive it. But I'm in the midst of writing a blog right now called The Inevitable Famine, and it sounds like a clickbait title, but when you start looking at the embodied energy in food, the erosion of skills, soil erosion in general, I think I read a stat recently, 1 ton of industrial grown grain erodes 7 metric tons of topsoil, which is where our dead zones are coming from. Aquifer depletion, soil salinity. In Canada, we're dealing a lot with food sovereignty issues, which basically erode decentralized food production and consumer choice by removing the right to purchase raw milk or produce raw milk, or even the right to save seed as farmers. The decline in farmers in North America and the general lack of nutrient dense food that's even available. What struck me about food forestry and bioshelter market gardens is we're largely exploring the exact same issues on our property right now. We've got a food forest in the front yard and a passive solar greenhouse in the backyard. And I think that these systems of perennial food production, not to say that we shouldn't be doing annual stuff as well, that it all fits into the mix. And low energy greenhouses that are adaptive regardless of how the climate shifts going forward are highly valuable skill sets and modes of operation that people can start to grasp and take control of right now in their life. And it's wonderful that there's people out there like you that have spent the last 30 years pioneering these concepts, right alongside all of the, your colleagues in Australia and in Europe and South America, right in our backyard. And so I just want to thank you for putting your hard-won knowledge, as Sarah says, into these 2 books and sharing it with the world and having the courage and I think Mollison had this saying, and I'm just trying to remember what it was, says that you have to be doggedly persistent. You can't ever give up. You can't quit, even when things get tough. And I know that, like, sometimes I wake up in the morning and think, oh man, it's got to push this permaculture rock up the hill because people don't know what it is, or it's such a big concept, or it seems like it's just starting to wake up now. But then there's other days when everybody seems to be using the word, and to go back into the 1980s and think about what that rock would have been like to push up that hill is humbling at the least. So I wanted to thank you for taking the time today to have this conversation, and perhaps we can have another one in the future. We're going to announce the winner of the book giveaway here right away, and then we'll open it up to questions for folks. If you've got any questions for Darrell, Darrell's been at this longer than almost anybody in North America. So what an incredible opportunity you guys have to ask him some difficult questions. If you haven't signed up to our newsletter list and you want to get a coupon code for the book for 25% for the next 48 hours, make sure you do that. The link is in the show notes below. And so you'll get onto our list, and then you'll be notified about future sessions. We've got lots of great authors and topics coming up on the show, and so you won't want to miss that. And so hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot there, Sarah, but have you found a lucky person to give this book away to?
I did. Jeffrey Willems is our winner today.
Okay, great. So Jeff, I'm going to put my email address up into the chat notes there. And I'll do that here in a second. I'm going to actually go back because there's a couple of questions that I wanted to convey over to Darrell. And if you guys have any other questions, feel free to get them up into the chat window right now. There's actually 2 questions that I saw here. So Jeffrey Willems actually says, do you guys have some ideas on how to spread it to communities and make it more accessible? And then I asked Jeff to clarify a little bit more. And he said, I believe our urban centers need the most attention, and ways we can you provide some ideas or ways to accelerate the principles of permaculture faster? Do you have any thoughts, Darrell, on that?
Well, I know there's, excuse me, there's many permaculture guilds and organizations in cities all over the country. I'm on the board of the Permaculture Institute of North America, which is a professional development organization. But we, PINA has links. I suppose you could contact our office manager and ask for references in your area through the PINA.in website. But there's lots of people out there doing it. There's lots of meetup groups, organizations. Permaculture has definitely infiltrated. It's spreading its roots wide. I guess it's more like a mycelium ready to shoot up fungi all over the place, mushrooms. So I would just try to connect with your local groups. And again, we need people doing examples and maybe telling people about what you do. So even if it's your backyard garden, in a cold frame, or buying from your farmer's market, self-assessment to how you can be more sustainable.
Right.
I say that everyone doesn't have to be a market gardener, but everybody needs to know one.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll just put a plug in for our local permaculture group, Permaculture Calgary. You can find that on Google. And we actually have a potluck coming up this Saturday. So if you want to join or continue this conversation, you should check that out. It's at the Winston Heights Community Center in northeast Calgary. And so we'd love to see you out there. We try and make it out to every event, and it's always a good meal and a fantastic conversation. So come on out and continue the conversation with us this weekend if you're from Calgary. And if not, find your own local permaculture community group. So Oswald Spangler says, and I'm not sure, does Darrell have any interest in merging permaculture with the economics of the commons or commonwealth? Do you have any thoughts on that, Darrell?
Oh, I mean, I know of co-housing groups that have like permaculture landscapes, and certainly Garfield Community Farm here in Pittsburgh, they have their project of a local Presbyterian church, and their mission is to basically provide food to low-income neighborhoods through a mobile market. We drive around every Wednesday or Thursday night, different years, but I'm not exactly clear what the question means, but there's lots of ways for community groups and community activities to be interconnected. I have a permaculture friend who, when her people in her neighborhood have babies or someone dies or a new person buys a house, she gives them a fruit tree as a gift. And so then she shares her plums and cherries, and her neighbors might have apples. And so there's ways to like green your neighborhood in the existing communities.
Yeah, we've been involved in a fairly large community garden and bioshelter greenhouse actually in Invermere, BC. And so it's about a 1/4 acre food forest and a 2,000 square foot passive solar greenhouse with annualized geosolar. And this thing doesn't go below zero, and it's a community owned and managed asset. So these things take an enormous amount of effort to make and maintain. But once they're going and you've got a good community structure, who knows what's possible. I'm part of this is just something that's been rattling around in my brain recently, but I'm part of a cross-country ski club here in Calgary, and there's 500 people in that group, and they've managed to generate enough revenue and interest in cross-country skiing that they have $100,000 worth of snowmaking equipment, and they've got groomers, and they've got quads and trailers and websites and all this stuff. And so coming back to Darrell's comment about joining and participating in permaculture community groups, if cross-country ski groups can do this, permaculture community groups can do it. But instead of buying snow grooming and making equipment, we can buy farms and tractors and plant food forests and make that available to anybody in that community, and even beyond that as well. So it takes people stepping up and putting in a ton of work to build those common spaces. So Darrell, do you have any closing thoughts before we close out this live stream today?
Yeah, I think, with all the talk of, climate change, environmental issues, all those things were what inspired me. I had a 1988 National Geographic chart, that picked a global map of deforestation, fishery loss, desertification, overpopulation. And I would show this in my permaculture courses and say, these are the issues we're dealing with. But when you're out there working on the land and you're, the first monarch butterfly of the season arrives and the hummingbirds are in your garden, and, the summer rains passed and everything's a little damp and you can smell the moisture, and you're eating, the first apple off your tree. It's just really the future is abundant. It's beautiful, and it's amazing. Regeneration happens once you start working the land. It's just, these things aren't, when I started, I stood there looking at this 5-acre field, And I'm like, can you do this? Can you market garden on this level with rototillers? And I'm like, well, we're going to try, but you know, the rewards are kind of intangible, but there's a lot of beauty in the world. And I think that's a big part of permaculture, is to, you know, to create and build and grow the beauty of the world. And so it's just really gratifying to see now in 2019 how far it's spread and how many people are out there doing amazing projects. And I would also add that it is really great to be part of the News Society family. You know, they occasionally send me to speak at Mother Earth News Fairs. And when I teach permaculture courses or I go to Mother Earth News Fairs and meet people, it's also really gratifying to meet people who care and who understand about the problems and who are creating solutions. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Darrell. I really appreciate you taking the time today to chat with our channel. And Sarah, did you have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Darrell. And, you know, this is a really great opportunity for me because we don't always get to see our authors in person. And yes, it's virtual, but I think the last time I saw Darrell was at the Seven Springs Fair, Mother Earth News Fair, and he was just very generous with his time. And I was like, I've come all this way and I'm just seeing this lodge. And he actually took me out and, you know, showed me around his community and actually showed me probably my first permaculture garden. So I just feel really blessed to be able to work with the both of you and all of our other authors. And thanks to all the people listening and learning.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for joining in today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We've got some great shows coming up. We're going to be talking more about sustainable building. We've got some more conversations happening around food. If you've signed in today and you were listening and you have any feedback, you can definitely let us know. Shoot us a comment on YouTube. If you found this valuable today, I'd love it if you gave me a thumbs up on this video. It will be going live on YouTube shortly after it gets processed. And if you're not subscribed to the channel and you want to be notified when we go live, hit the subscribe button and then hit it again when the bell comes up to be notified when new videos show up on our channel and when we go live. So thanks so much, guys. I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.